we'll ignore the cries of piracy and all that because we've covered this subject so many times. But I think now this is maybe one of the reasons why we're not so excited. We're not so we're not knowing about wine so much, because the games are shifting away from the desktop PC completely. You have your mini games and the fun games like your Tetris type clones that Linux has in abundance, and they're great because you use them when you're downloading software, when you chat to somebody in the chat room and just killing a bit of time, or on your desktop when you're typing a document up. But I think people are now seeing these sort of entertainment in quotes being on the lounge television with sitting in front of it with your family. And I think games are moving more towards the movie industry in terms of storylines and stuff like that. So I think the gaming, the current gaming climate is one of the things that's responsible for wine's lack of excitement in 2011. That's my personal view. But we always say that every time we have a discussion and it goes on the game, I want to make this clear: we don't want the TechBytes show to be about gaming. Sometimes it crops up of relevance, but I just thought I'd throw that article in. From Torrent Freak, and I will link it in the show notes for those that are interested.
It's one of the very good test cases, though, for the viability of a certain platform. If you don't have very good interaction with hardware, which of course depends then on the hardware makers making available to you a good driver, it's really down to the driver. You know, the hardware stays the same. You got your card, it's capable of doing exactly the same in Linux as it's capable of doing in Windows. You just rely on the person writing a good driver for you to do that.
I think though for a developer, and this is just my opinion, but I would suggest that for a developer, the draw of the consoles would be a lot greater than the draw of the PC, because you know the platform you're working with when you develop a game for the console, whereas we can have a multitude of different things stuffed inside our desktop PC cases. And I think it's that combined with the lack of, it is more difficult for the piracy issue to rear its head on a console than it is for the PC.
Of course, the same applies to phones, though, and this is one of the reasons when they talk about fragmentation or so-called fragmentation. I don't like this word because you can just make it sound like a wonderful thing if you just call it something else. You just call it diversity. Oh, diversity. Oh, that's a wonderful thing. Oh no, fragmentation. That's terrible. It's one of those. You have lots of these terms, and how you spin a positive as a negative, or vice versa.
If I could just very quickly say so before you mention it, Roy. But you know, the fragmentation. You mentioned this about Android. Yeah, fragmentation, in my opinion, would be an issue if Android was a closed system, and it's not. If like you imagine the Sony PlayStation 3, now if that was fragmented, you had different versions and people having different versions of the PS3 running in their home, then yes, as a developer, that would be a big issue. But I think because it's an open platform. I don't think fragmentation makes any or much difference at all. Was my view too.
Yeah, well, also the notion, people apply the notion of fragmentation to things like carriers, as opposed to even things like the platform itself. Of course, the platform itself, there is only one Android. There are the branches and like the free versions of it, and people working on things which are based on it. But you know, people say Linux is fragmented and there's so many Linux options, and people say, well, there is one Linux. Go to kernel.org. There is seriously one Linux. Yeah. Then they actually talk about things you put on top of that. But there is just one Linux, and I don't think there was ever any viable thing which deviated. I mean, so many people work on it, and you don't actually see it as a same thing that's going to be very imminent for a person to really fork Android and cause a lot of a mess, you know. I think there is more of a chance of something like OpenOffice having more deviation than Android. One of the issues it's causing, though, it's usually for developers, it's not for users. And this was also said by Nokia, I think a year and a half ago. They were basically defending their Migo platform, saying, well, diversity or you know, they use the word fragmentation. They say it's actually good for the user. It's not very good for the developer, because the developer doesn't know what screen size to expect, for example, or what hardware specifications to have the person will have. I'll go further and say that if every person used the same computers, it would be quite nice to web designers and people who generally do design, because they don't have to develop a web page or to write it. They just give you a poster. They just define, okay, this is my screen size, this is the hardware. I can just put the font here, this goes there, and everything just like pixel perfect on the right places. And you can just produce a poster instead of worrying about, what phones do I use, or what platform is it going to be? Instead, you actually specify in a language what roughly it's going to look like. Of course, now we have different devices, so it's not just computers, and that kind of complicates things.
I mean, that's the point. I was trying to make it. A big deal was made of fragmentation. It hasn't been an issue. I mean, we've never seen any issues over the last sort of year where Android, for example, has really found its feet and found a place in the hearts of many users. But you look at the functionality. You look at what we're doing on phones now, for example, and to consider that this is all based on an open source ethos and open source grounding is quite amazing when you look back 10, 15 years, where the idea that people contributing to projects, people having access to source code of things that were in the mainstream would be completely alien. I mean, you just have to look back to the days of 16-bit computing to see that this type of ethos and this type of working was still in its infancy and completely alien at the time, certainly for the average user sitting in the home with an Amiga plugged up to a television set. So I think it's a very good thing, and I think it's maybe the reason why we're not so excited by things like Wine, and that the days of proprietary, certainly on the desktop, are slowly ebbing away, with the exception of custom applications for certain industries that wouldn't be able to find an open source solution on the net. And maybe gaming as well, obviously. I think we've discussed that before. I think you've got different views to me, but I think it's a testament to open source itself and how it's going to pan out in the future. I don't know if you...
I'm not too positive on the issue. Well, Android is considered to be open source, but I think what it's doing now, it's doing to Linux what Linux used to do to GNU. What it's basically doing, it's overriding the previous person's work. It's kind of expanding it, making it a bit more. It's making concessions first of all to get more users. The GNU project was supposed to be all about freedom and providing a free system for people who want to have access to it. The main goal was not necessarily to get lots of users, but to offer some freedom. And then you had Linux, which was more practical and more pragmatic and got lots of users, and GNU was a very nice addition to it. And now you have those platforms like, I don't want to say Ubuntu, and I'll come to it in a second, but Android is taking away some of the development culture out of Linux. It's mostly one company developing Android. It's not really a consortium of companies working around Linus Torvalds. And also they have you might say Android is open source, but what do you do with Android? You mostly run applications. And almost all the applications are not just proprietary applications, but they're also applications which might have data stored remotely. They might have some spyware elements, and they are protected to some extent by DRM-like mechanisms. They can even delete your application remotely, and this is what happened with Android just a couple of days ago. It turned out it's because of some sort of bug or something wasn't working correctly. It was a Flash-based application. Google removed it remotely from people's devices, which I thought that's probably the first time they do that. They delete it from your device without your permission. And they can say, well, it's for your benefit, but still, it's not a good sign when they do that. And actually take authority like that. One of the, I
was just going to say that does make me very uncomfortable. Even if it was with the best of intentions, it does make me very uncomfortable.
It very much reminds you, I suppose, of the Amazon had a huge controversy back in 2009 or 2000. I think 2009. It feels like it. They basically deleted people's books from their Kindle, and the reason was this was not a legal copy, or they claimed it not to be a legal copy, but still, it's people's devices. And this wasn't even a phone, okay? So this wasn't a device that's connected and being kind of, it's your book reader. That's supposed to be your book. You take on vacation, all of a sudden delete your book because what's his name, Jeff Bezos decided you don't deserve to have this book. It's very 1984-ish type of thing. And guess which book was deleted? 1984, which was a very interesting situation. And
well, I mean, it's very much like the whole the BitTorrent issue on Apple's iPhone. Apple apparently is not very happy in you having a BitTorrent application, although there is 1,001 legitimate reasons why you'd want one. And you could envisage a future where pressure is put onto